Committee will come to order. Good afternoon. We welcome everyone here today, both my colleagues and our distinguished witnesses this afternoon and the folks here who have taken the time to sit through this testimony. I'd also like to extend a special greeting to Chairman Royce and Chairman Smith, who will be here shortly, who will be joining us this afternoon. It's been a very busy couple of days for issues regarding Vietnam here in Congress. Yesterday, nearly 800 Vietnamese Americans came to a Capitol Hill for the Vietnamese American Advocacy Day to meet with their representatives and discuss the most pressing issues facing the U.S.-Vietnam relationship. And I had the honor and pleasure to address about 350 people in the auditorium of the Capitol Visitor Center yesterday morning, and that was a great opportunity to meet quite a few people. I extend a special welcome to those of you who are here in the audience today. As I mentioned, I'd also like to ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from California, Mr. Lowenthal, be permitted to sit in this afternoon and be recognized after all other members of the subcommittee have been recognized for questions. Without objection, so ordered. Today's hearing, I think, is particularly timely, not only because of yesterday's Advocacy Day celebrating and recognizing the importance of Vietnamese Americans as part of the greater fabric of this country, but also because the state of the U.S.-Vietnam relationship is at a critical juncture. Vietnam is a country that over the course of the past 2 decades has made great strides in reforming its economy and accelerating its growth. In 2018, Vietnam will be formally recognized as a market economy, and by 2020, it hopes to reach industrialized country status. This is tremendous, especially since many of us here in this room remember the war-torn country it was some 38 years ago, including especially my colleague, our ranking member, Mr. Felio Mavega, to my left, to your right, who served during the Vietnam War there, and we thank him for his service to our country. In addition, the U.S. is now Vietnam's largest trading partner and one of its top foreign investors, and Vietnam's participation in negotiations is considered a big step in recognizing Vietnam's growing influence in the Asia-Pacific region, even if it is becoming more and more uncertain areas. It's unfortunate that USTR refused our invitation to join today's hearing because trade is a key aspect of this bilateral relationship, and many of that office's ongoing efforts are contingent upon progress on other areas, notably human rights. Hopefully, our witnesses from the State Department can relay any concerns that we express this afternoon. As we have witnessed Vietnam's economic role in Asia evolve, its overall strategic and geopolitical importance has grown in parallel. Vietnam's interest in forming a relationship faces an array of opportunities. There is also a long list of challenges that are hard to ignore, namely the entirety of Vietnam's human rights are broadened and are probably even getting worse. Members of the subcommittee staff visited Vietnam earlier this year to investigate the human rights conditions, among other things, inside Vietnam, during which they heard directly from a variety of individuals who validated those concerns about human rights. Just in the last few weeks, we have seen Vietnam's government crack down on dissent by arresting blogger Truong Nguyen Nhiat for allegedly abusing human rights issues at that park, detaining 20 individuals just this past weekend for protesting the recent ramming of a Vietnamese trawler by Chinese Navy vessel, Hyun Nam Chen, from traveling to the U.S. These examples, I think, give us plenty of reasons to think that the number of religious leaders, bloggers, and politically active is whether Vietnam is doing enough to warrant the current level of assistance and cooperation that it receives from the U.S. Even the State Department's 2012 Human Rights Report paints a picture that this may not be acceptable. As the human rights condition in Vietnam deteriorates, enhancing security increase the levels of IMET, that's International Military and Education Training, and FMF, which is Foreign Military Financing Assistance, while decreasing assistance in other areas. These increases need to be justified. Fundamentally, Vietnam disagrees with the basic definition of human rights and what it means to protect the basic rights of its people. So I consider it even ever more difficult to verify that U.S. taxpayer dollars are being appropriately utilized in these areas, if any, Vietnam made. At the same time, I hope that you can elaborate on how the administration is pressuring Vietnam to take action and detail what the administration issue areas is really what most of us here, I believe, want to see. Until Vietnam implements the proper reforms and demonstrates its commitment to, for example, if and when TPP negotiations reach a final agreement, it must be approved by Congress, and Vietnam's participation will likely face considerable scrutiny because of the magnitude of its human rights abuses. For his statement, and following his statement, I'll recognize Chairman Royce for 5 minutes and Chairman Smith of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations also for 5 minutes. And following their remarks, we'll recognize any additional members who wish to speak for 1 minute, and then we'll proceed with our witnesses' testimony and then questions from us. And then we'll adjourn after all that. I now yield to my friend from American Samoa, the distinguished ranking member of this committee, Ini Fale-Mavega, for making his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, would like to offer my personal welcome to Secretary Yoon and Secretary Bear, representing our State Department here for this hearing this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, 7 years ago, President George W. Bush visited Vietnam, at which time he stated, and I quote, "History has a long march to it." So, as a Vietnam veteran, I truly believe it is time for the U.S. to play fair. In December of last year, I met with Vietnam's Prime Minister and also with the Vice President of the National Assembly, Madam Tong Phinh Phong, with the Foreign Minister, the Vice Chair to advancing U.S.-Vietnam relations and promoting human rights. Vietnam is party to almost all core international rights treaties, and so Norway, Switzerland, and even the United States. Vietnam is working to improve its human rights records by strengthening its legal system to get its message out. Vietnam does not have a community of U.S. campaign contributors to solidify congressional support for the progress it is making. So while I believe in the speech in free critics, if the critics are sincere, let them call for the United States to clean up the mess we left behind in Vietnam. Losing tens and thousands of innocent civilians, including men, women, and children, to one of the most deadliest chemical compounds ever known to man, dioxin. Legal liability, and questions Vietnam's assertions about the problems associated with Agent Orange. And I haven't even begun to address the serious problems of the thousands of our own men and women in military who were also exposed to this deadly toxic substance. Mr. Chairman, as a Vietnam veteran, can to help the people of Vietnam, because just like the Vietnamese, Pacific Islanders still suffer the lingering effects of genetic abnormalities, islanders who were exposed to nuclear contamination. For example, from 1946 to 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. The number and intensity of these tests was equal to 7,000 Hiroshima bombs, atomic bombs, or to the dropping of 1.6 Hiroshima bombs every day for a 12-year period, was itself equivalent to 1,300 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb that we dropped in World War II. Acknowledged as the greatest nuclear explosion ever detonated, the Bravo test vaporized 6 islands and created a mushroom cloud for 25 miles in diameter. Because people were living in these Pacific Islands during the 24 years after the U.S. nuclear testing program began, the people of the Rongelap Atoll are still exiled from their own land due to the radioactive fallout, and many women still give birth to what some label as jelly babies or deformed babies born with no bones, no eyes, no heads, no limbs, no legs. In 2007, after becoming the chairman of the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee, I visited Vietnam. I visited the hospitals, met with the veterans and the children and government leaders. I saw jelly babies in bottles, and I saw no critics from Capitol Hill calling for the U.S. to do the right thing by the people and the government of Vietnam. For the record, Mr. Chairman, after every year, America has always helped countries rebuild. And that $1 billion in 2005 dollars. To Germany, from 46 to 52, the United States provided a total of $29.3 in Vietnam. Why are we doing everything we can to push Vietnam away? Vietnam is of strategic importance to the United States, yet we have only had renewed diplomatic relations since 1995. President Clinton and President George W. Bush both visited Vietnam, and I encourage President Obama to do the same. I especially thank the U.S. for the good. I also commend Vietnam for its fast-track progress for the registration of religious groups and publication of bilingual Bibles. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. To clarify many of the matters before us today, I'm including a more detailed statement from the Embassy of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in the United States. On a personal note, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to introduce to you and to our colleagues, I'm so proud and honored to have them in our presence. They worked for months in raising what money they were able to do, come all the way from my little district to visit our nation's capital, our young students here for the Close-Up Foundation. Can you stand up, please? I know that won't be possible, but maybe another time. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fairley-Vega. And we'd now like to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Chairman Smith, who's the subcommittee chairman on Africa, global health.
Agreements that we have with them. Yesterday, Mr. Chairman, I actually chaired my 14th congressional hearing exclusively focused on human rights abuses committed by the government of Vietnam, with an emphasis on confiscated properties of U.S. citizens and with some emphasis on religious persecution. Human rights abuse by the Vietnamese dictatorship is in a race to the bottom with governments of North Korea, worsening a situation. He points out that in the first few months of 2013, more people have been convicted in political trials as in the whole of the last year. 8 years. On May 26th, police arrested a blogger and charged him with abusing democracy, but it has not matriculated from a dictatorship to a democracy, and these kinds of actions further underscore that that's not in the process of happening. On May 28th, 8 ethnic Montagnards were convicted of undermining national security. Them got sentences of some 7 rights documents, were broken up, and of course they too are now facing retaliation. I would point out to my colleagues that there are many people. I have been to Vietnam a number of times. The Venerable Thich Quang Do is still under pagoda arrest. They have made illegal Unified Buddhist Church of to replace it. So all of these Buddhist Thich Quang Do remain isolated, arrested, or under house arrest, or in his case, pagoda arrest. Father Lee, we thought there was a break, maybe some opening after the bilateral agreement. That has not happened. My friend Mr. Fairley-Vega said it's time to see things for what they are. That's precisely what John Sifton said from Human Rights Watch. It's things for what they are. There was hope a few years ago that attempting a military strategic dialogue with Vietnam, with opening trade negotiations in the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, might serve as an incentive for Vietnam to make changes and perhaps soften its authoritarian edge. It now appears, he goes on to say, that this hope was misplaced. Vietnamese authorities have not unclenched their fists. I would ask our distinguished friends who are here for the administration, specifically, if the benchmarks and says, we stand with the oppressed, not with the oppressor. And we're talking about releasing religious prisoners, religion, assembly, and association. Message to the government of Vietnam and Hanoi, impose CPC. There's no doubt that religious freedom has deteriorated. I held all the hearings and moved the markup of Frank Wolf's bill, the International Religious Freedom Act, back in 1998. There is no doubt that Vietnam ought to be classified as a country of particular concern. And in like manner, I was the prime sponsor of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. There is no doubt, whether it be on labor as a backdrop to the law that is already on the books. I would hope that they would do that. And I yield back and thank the Chair for yielding such time to me.
The gentleman's time.
Thank you, Chairman, for calling this hearing, and Ranking Member. The relationship between the United States and Vietnam is changing rapidly. We can celebrate the rapid assimilation and ascent of the Vietnamese American community, both in my home state in California, but then throughout this country, and the contributions that they've. It is good to see that we are normalizing relationships and increasing our economic ties between the countries. Obviously, that does come with responsibilities as Vietnam joins the global economic community. And those responsibilities do come with the necessity to treat its citizens with basic human rights. That change is going to be gradual, but whatever we can do to help facilitate that as we normalize relationships. In addition, we've talked within this committee and the broader committee on the importance of the South China Sea and the challenges that we face there as China starts to exert its influence there, but the importance of countries, middle countries like Vietnam, as well as the partnership between India and Vietnam. So I look forward to hearing the testimony of the witnesses, getting your analysis on how we move forward in this relationship. And again, I think there are huge possibilities here.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, who's the Vice Chairman of the subcommittee, is recognized for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It pleases me that this hearing is being convened today to bring attention to the nexus of human rights and trade negotiations with Vietnam as the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership looms in the near future. Vietnam, once a Stalinist state, has since the collapse of the Soviet bloc undergone a series of economic reforms, including the suspension of central planning, decollectivization of agriculture, removal of restrictions on private trade and enterprise, and a promotion of foreign trade and Western investment. However, some legacies of the Stalinism remain deeply entrenched. The ruling Vietnamese Communist Party, VCP, still claims to adhere to Marxism, Leninism, and rejects any meaningful political reform. The structure of the one-party totalitarian state is essentially the same, despite superficial modifications to align laws and institutions more closely with international norms. I believe we should be creative in considering new ways to pressure Vietnam on human rights issues in the wake of a worsening crackdown on dissent in the last year. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from California, Mr. Chairman, is recognized for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to focus on human rights. Dr. Bauer, thank you so much for your work at DRL. I hear good things. I also want to thank the Vietnamese community of the San Fernando Valley for keeping me informed on human rights issues in Vietnam. I want to particularly focus on Lee Quoc Quan, who has worked for the National Democratic Institute, and I want to commend to my colleagues a letter being organized by Loretta Sanchez to protest his incarceration. Likewise, there are the two students, Nguyen Phuong Oyen and Din Nguyen Ka, who are in prison right now for circulating a patriotic. Finally, Mr. Nguyen, I hope that our diplomats who report to you ultimately are going to visiting as many human rights detainees as possible, visiting the trials, and exposing this to the world while at the same time emphasizing its importance to the United States. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, who is chairman of the Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats Subcommittee, is recognized.
Been brought to mind by my good friend, Mr. Inifalamuega's statements, and I recognize and appreciate very much that in the military, and certainly didn't face combat as Mr. Falamuega did, but I don't think the United States has anything to apologize for in terms of what we have tried to do for the people of Vietnam. 50,000 Americans died there, and we are with the people of Vietnam and succeed where we failed in the past. And success will be when the Marxist dictatorship, the corrupt gangsters that were installed after we left for that day, and that's would be something that would hopefully what we could do for the people of Vietnam as we, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. I'm looking forward to going through some more details about the trade agreement that we are looking for. But whatever we do should not in any way strengthen the dictator's hands around the necks of the people of Vietnam. But instead, we should make sure everything we do economically helps lead the people of Vietnam, empowering them so perhaps they, at long last, can enjoy the freedom that they sacrificed for as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard, is recognized for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Flema-Vainga, for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to Mr. Yoon and Dr. Baer for your presence and your insights here today as well. There's no question that our strategic and economic engagements with Vietnam have been a good example of showing what we can overcome when we have a difficult past, and how to turn that negative into a positive and have very productive relationship going forward. In my state of Hawaii, we have numerous ties to Vietnam, strategic, economic, cultural, as well as familial ties with a very large Vietnamese community in my state of Hawaii. And I think it's important for us to focus on continuing to build an even stronger partnership with the entire Southeast Asia region, but also recognize that as we do that, it's our responsibility to find creative ways to ensure that we are addressing with the Vietnamese government the human rights challenges and obstacles that we continue to see and we continue to face. In November, Secretary Hagel on Saturday invite the ASEAN countries, of which Vietnam is also a member, to a meeting next year in Hawaii, which will be another great opportunity to engage with our friends.
We'll begin with Joseph Wayun. Joseph Yoon is currently Acting Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State. He previously held the position of Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. Mr. Yoon joined the Foreign Service in 1985 and has served in the Republic of Korea, Thailand, France, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. He is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service class of Minister Counselor. Before joining the Foreign Service, Mr. Yoon was a senior economist for Data Resources Incorporated in Lexington, Massachusetts, and we welcome you here once again this afternoon, Mr. Yoon. And we also have Daniel B. Baer, who was sworn in as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor on November 23, 2009. Donna School of Business, where he taught business ethics to MBA and undergraduate students there. From 2004 to 2007, Dr. Baer worked at the Boston Consulting Group, where he was a project leader and provided strategic advice to leaders in the corporate, government, and nonprofit sectors. And as I say, we welcome you both here this afternoon. I'm sure you're both familiar with the 5-minute rule. A yellow light will come on when you have 1 minute to wrap up, and the red light comes on.
Relationship with Vietnam. It's also a great pleasure to be here with my friend and colleague Dan Baer from Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. Dan will, of course, has been leading our human rights dialogue with Vietnam, and he will discuss human rights issues with you at some length. I'll offer the administration's perspective on our overall relationship with Vietnam, which has become an important emerging partner for the United States. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit a more detailed version for the record.
Without objection. Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Our policy goals in Vietnam reflect the growing breadth of our relationship. We seek to promote the following in Vietnam: a market-oriented economy that U.S. exports and investment, cooperation in advancing regional peace and security, and for Vietnam to increase respect for human freedom of religion, embrace of good governance, and rule of law. In many ways, we've made enormous advances since we normalized diplomatic relations in 1995. Back then, the United States' two-way trade with Vietnam was $51 million. Today, we conduct closely the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a 21st century regional freight trade agreement that will economically integrate Vietnam with countries on both sides of the Asia-Pacific region. In addition to joining the TPP to address labor rights, we emphasize to Vietnam leaders that building a vibrant, innovative economy requires allowing people the freedom to and friends. There certainly are difficulties there. Too often, Vietnam's security services view with distrust overseas Vietnamese who want their homeland to become more open, more democratic, and more prosperous. We have urged the government of Vietnam to improve its own outreach to Vietnamese Americans and to address the community's human rights concerns, which the distrust has also been part of our bilateral relations because of a difficult past, but both built confidence and goodwill. For over 2 decades now, Vietnam has facilitated operations to recover the remains of American service members missing from the Vietnam War. We're also committed to helping Vietnam address the problems of unexploded ordnance and dioxin contamination at the former U.S. Air Base in Da Nang. Our cooperation on regional as a regional leader, we have worked together in ASEAN and other multilateral fora to encourage discussion of maritime security, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief issues facing the region. The United States also supports the efforts of Vietnam and other ASEAN members to negotiate with China conduct in the South China Sea and to resolve disputes through diplomatic and other peaceful means in accordance with international law. On the diplomatic side of the relationship, the United States and Vietnam are cooperating closely on security issues. We are also enhancing military-to-military exchanges and conducting joint training in search and rescue and disaster relief. The United States welcomes Vietnam's plans to deploy its first troops overseas in support of UN peacekeeping missions in 2014. To help with this effort, the U.S. is providing broad-based professional military education to the Vietnamese military to help them prepare for these missions. Our forward-looking relationship with Vietnam manifests itself most clearly in people-to-people relationships. There are over 15,000 Vietnamese students now studying in the U.S., which makes Vietnam the 8th largest sender of foreign students to the United States. This is a dramatic change from 1995, when only 800 Vietnamese students were studying here. While we have an ambitious agenda with Vietnam, I would underscore that the issue of human rights permeates our entire policy approach to Vietnam, and that we have emphasized that progress in human rights is critical to make progress in all other areas of relationship. Mr. Chairman, we firmly believe open debate and free expression are essential to achieving a stable and prosperous future for Vietnam. We respect Vietnam's independence and sovereignty, and we believe that allowing all of Vietnamese people to have a voice in determining their future is critical to achieving the full potential. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yoon. Dr. Baer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for holding this very important hearing and for your concern about the human rights situation in Vietnam. We share that concern, and I too would like to submit a longer statement for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
The Department of State recently submitted to Congress both the annual country reports on human rights practices and the report on international religious freedom. These two reports, prepared by my Bureau with collaboration from colleagues at posts around the world, provide a detailed snapshot of the facts underlying our concerns related to human rights in Vietnam. In April, I led a delegation to Vietnam that included representatives from the White House and the Department of Homeland Security for the U.S.-Vietnam Human Rights Dialogue. We emphasized that 2013 represents an opportunity for the government of Vietnam to choose to improve its human rights record and laid out some of the urgent areas for work. We acknowledged positive steps such as the release, albeit with restrictions, of activist Lê Quang Dinh, facilitation of a visit by an international human rights organization, the government and the Vatican, and also what appears to be potential positive movement for the human rights of LGBT persons. We watch with great interest the flood of public comments about the draft Constitution and are encouraged by the government's decision to extend the comment period. It is now incumbent upon the authority, as Congressman Smith noted, nor have the isolated positive steps formed a consistent pattern. In increasing numbers, bloggers continue to be harassed and jailed for peaceful online speech. It has implications for every aspect of our relationship. Let me outline quickly a few of our concerns. Many of Vietnam's more than 120 political prisoners are in jail for writing online about police corruption. Nguyen Van Hai, or Duc Khai, peacefully expressed his views online and protested his country's policies towards China meat in prison. Do Thi Minh Han, Don Huy Chung, and Nguyen Hong Quoc Hung were arrested in February of 2010, seeks to control information, even as that control is increasingly slipping. We are very concerned about Vietnam's internet policies of blocking, hacking, surveillance, and its detention of bloggers. Draft regulations on internet content management seek to restrict the flow of information even further. Nonetheless, Vietnam's internet penetration continues to grow, and the country has seen a blossoming of blog-minded websites such as An Ba Sam have been targeted with hacking and disabling. A frequent refrain I hear whenever I visit Vietnam is the need for better implementation of laws that are on the books. Constitutionally, citizens have the right to free speech, freedom of religious belief, and other human rights. But we all know, for example, that many members of Christian, Buddhist, and other groups face harassment and are required to, but then not allowed to register. The new Decree 92, which came into effect in January, could be implemented in a way that further restricts rather than promotes religious freedom guaranteed in the Constitution. Vietnamese law guarantees access to a lawyer and guarantees defense lawyers equal standing with the prosecutor. Reality, though, plays out differently. I've heard repeatedly from the lawyers of political prisoners who are not permitted to access case files, who are given unequal accommodations in courtrooms, are not allowed to use computers, and are not allowed time to defend their clients. Some laws also clearly need to change, laws that run counter to international human rights norms, trade, travel, and cultural connections. Those on both sides of the ocean have benefited, in particular Vietnamese living in Vietnam, where the standard of living has increased as the population becomes better off and more educated. As we talk about human rights, we should all remember that our concerns are really echoes of the concerns being voiced and discussed by millions of people inside Vietnam. They get it. They know the status quo won't do. They see that although Vietnam has become a more prosperous country, without progress on human rights, there are limits to what Vietnam can achieve. We want to reinforce them, and we want to work closely with members of the committee to push Vietnam to improve its protections for human rights. Again, thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to working with you and taking your questions.
Thank you very much. And now we'll ask questions, and I'll begin with myself. Historically, Vietnam and China have had an uneasy relationship, quite complicated, hot and cold. As the colossal neighbor to its north, Chinese influence has been very strong, yet China's growing aggressiveness in the South China Sea and threats to Vietnam's territorial claims and harassment of Vietnamese fishing trawlers has pushed Vietnam to reevaluate its strategic position. Despite Vietnam's efforts to reach out and develop closer ties with the U.S., even embracing our role as a Pacific power, Vietnam remains cautious about stirring up tensions with China or calling out China for its actions. Just this past weekend, Vietnamese police detained over 20 people protesting Chinese naval vessels ramming Vietnamese fishing trawlers. I'd ask both panel members this year, and how is the administration using various aspects of cooperation to leverage Vietnam's troubled relationship with China, while at the same time pressuring Vietnam to be more respectful of human rights? So I'd ask both Mr. Yoon and Dr. Baer to respond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think it was in a different setting last time. We discussed the difficult history issues that the area has, and I would say this is another difficult history issue between China and Vietnam going back generations, if not centuries and more, and they've had, of course, history of war with each other. And of course, China is in reality its giant neighbor, and that always brings caution and wanting to, at once assert and play safely. With regards to Vietnam's strategic position and how they want to deal with China, I would say they are in very close contact with ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and to try to get ASEAN unified in issues such as South China Sea. And I think that was what was referring to. With regards to their crackdown on demonstration, again, it is still, as my colleague Dan spelled out and as Representative Smith mentioned, very much controlled state. So there is a limit to what they will do before it gets out of hand. I would note that at the same time when they arrested some demonstrators on this particular instance, they let the LGBT demonstration go on. So,
Mr. Baer, I'll tell you what, I've got one more question I wanted to get in, so I think Mr. Yoon very effectively answered that question, so let me give you a different one. At yesterday's hearing on continuing repression by the Vietnamese government, the witnesses alleged that they and other U.S. citizens of Vietnamese origin have been victims of property confiscation by the Vietnamese government after they became U.S. citizens. Many of them wrote to the legal advisor's office at the Department of State to request intervention, but were told to retain lawyers in Vietnam and resolve their claims according to domestic law in the local jurisdiction. The Vietnamese National Assembly passed a resolution declaring that the Vietnamese government would no longer entertain any claim for the return of land or residential housing under state management.
Thank you very much. I am aware of these concerns. I would like to ask your permission to consult with the Department's legal counsel and respond to you in a written response to take that question back.
All right, that would be fine. Mr. Yoon, would you want to comment on that? On the topic overall, if not.
On the topic overall, again, the rule of law issues are very important here. On this particular case, I think it's we will consult with our legal affairs and get you really a proper answer, sir.
All right, thank you. In the short time I have left, I would just note that the same issue had come up with respect to Cambodia recently. We met with some of the leadership there, and this is an ongoing problem in Cambodia as well. And my time has now expired, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Samoa, Mr. Falemovega, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want a quick question here for Secretary Yun. I sounded that we've come a long way in terms of trying to establish a better relationship with our Vietnamese American community and with that of the officials of the government of Vietnam. Can you elaborate a little further on that in terms of at what point where you say that many of our Vietnamese American community members are investing in Vietnam? How many have visited the home country since? Has there been any estimates on the... Anyway, our Vietnamese American community is about, what, 2.5 million?
I don't have, I'll look for an estimate how many have gone, but certainly, as you know, I've visited Vietnam many times over the past few.
In previous hearings that we've had, I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, that I recognize, with utmost respect, our colleague from Smith. I do attribute all this to his hard work and always trying to make sure that human rights are feeded out properly to everywhere that we go, and especially representing our country. And I wanted to ask Secretary Baer, is there some kind of a gold standard that the State Department has established to say that this is how we apply human rights in a more equitable criticisms that we're putting? I'm not here to defend Vietnam. I'm just saying what standard are we applying? And if we are applying a standard, are we doing it evenly?
We seek to apply our internationally recognized human rights norms, many of which are encoded into international law. The best articulation of that, I don't know, but I would say that the best or one of the most available analyses of that is you can, I'm happy to provide free.
It's perception. I remember years ago when we visited with President Min of China, and we were talking about the human rights violation there, and President Min turned around and said, you know, I have a very different perception and definition of what human rights are. My responsibility as President of the People's Republic of China, if I am not putting food, clothing, and raiment for that person there in China, I am violating his human rights. An entirely different perception as how we look at things. And this is where I'm very concerned about. I remember years ago the Prime Minister of Samoa was outraged that the annual report that the State Department puts out on human rights come to the country and review the questions that they've had about prisoners and all of this. And this is where, how do we go about collecting the so-called, are they really facts or their opinions? Or how do you say that this is the standard that everybody should be following? And I'm just saying, if we are applying the same standard for Vietnam as we do Saudi Arabia or other countries that
other countries, you will find that indeed the standard we use is the standard laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other documents, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that the sections of the report go through and factually account for the situation in each country.
I've got 10 more seconds, just one real quick, and maybe you'll have to submit this in writing. How do you determine human rights in terms of the rendition operations that we did during the Iraq War? Would you consider that as a violation of human rights of just wishing people off for the operations that we did secretly? Renditions, taking people off from the countries without even any due process?
I will submit an answer in writing, but briefly I would say that universal human rights apply to everyone, including ourselves. Okay,
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The Chair will now recognize the Chairman of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, for 5 minutes either to make a statement or ask questions or whatever he would prefer to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much for doing this. My concern is that in 2013, you had 40 dissidents arrested in the first 6 weeks, a show trial, and long sentences. And this was more cases than all of last year in Vietnam. And sometimes when we're talking about these cases, I think our mistake is to not look at the details of the magnitude of human rights violations that occur and over such a trivial issue. Maybe not that trivial, because the two students that I wanted to bring up, Nguyen Phuong Nguyen and Din Nguyen Ka, were actually talking about the territorial integrity of their own country, of Vietnam, handing out leaflets. And for that, this 21-year-old girl, and this is a photo of her, and I think there was a photo earlier, now is sentenced to 6 years in prison. And here's my concern and why I'm bringing this to the attention of both of you. After she was arrested and before our sentencing, we had that dialogue. And nowhere in your remarks do I see mention of what happened to her. And according to her mother and according to her friend, when she was arrested, she was beaten into unconsciousness and kicked. Her mother reports the bruises on her neck, on her arms that her mother could see. She was carried away, charged, I guess the terminology is working against the interests of the state, or clear sentence, and her friend, in his 20s, another college student, he's sentenced to 8 years. It had that dialogue in April before her sentencing. How much, Doctor, did you speak up about this case, and what did you say the United States?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm glad you focused on the case of Nguyen Phuong Nguyen. When she was first arrested, I actually went to New York and said that he would take them back to Hanoi. And I raised them again in the course of the human rights dialogue. The fact that she wasn't mentioned in my...
We have to match our words. We are at that point with Vietnam, seriously. You can't have 40 cases like this in 6 weeks and not have the United States take decisive action. And the reason we're holding this hearing today is because we're demanding some semblance. I don't think it's too much to ask for her release and for the release of this other student who was taken into custody. Again, the crime here is passing out a leaflet that discusses the issue of the territorial questions, the territorial waters off the coast of Vietnam. How in the world can that constitute or justify the type of beating she went through and the type of prison sentence that she and her friend have been given? And if we are not going to use the leverage that we have in order to check these impulses to use violence, leverage we have not to make our actions match our words about this. And we're going to have to do something. And my suggestion is, among young people, over their future on this planet, when governments are as capricious as this. And there are other issues that you and I have talked about that I could bring up. But at this point in time, please let's at least set an example here that the dialogue we're having can bear some results, that we mean it when we say we want to work together for human rights and for the future. And this would be such an important place for the government in Vietnam to start with respect to these two students. And if I could just have a quick response.
You have my commitment that I will continue to raise this case and that I will press them to release her and her friend on the charges that they've been sentenced on.
Dr. Bear, thank you, and I appreciate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Bear, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a very firm believer that as economies develop, with that come freedoms and stability, and respect for a rule of law and a respect for basic rights of citizens. And again, that's you'll only get that progress. I'm curious. The chairman talked a little bit about land rights and land seizures, and again, if there isn't that rule of law, you're not going to see the gains necessary. And part of our success here in the United States is that we have that respective rule of law. I'm curious, Mr. Yoon or Dr. Barrett, on your perspectives of the possibility of seeing both of those go.
I mean, clearly, as many members have raised again, Vietnam has gone through serious economic growth over the last 20, 25 years. And I think they have a big opportunity coming up in TPP negotiations. It is a very high standard agreement with labor standard, investment standard, and also how you operate factories, safety standard. So I think that will be a key opportunity for the Vietnamese to seize and to make something out of it so that they can really attain twin goals. And we are expending some of our own assistance money for them to get there.
But it can't just be the economic growth and the economic reform. That has to come hand in hand with the rule of law, with the reforms on the citizens.
I agree. I mean, the rule of law issues are deeply connected to the crackdown on freedom of expression. They're deeply connected to the attempts that the government makes to prevent citizens from coming together in NGOs and advocating. And of course, we know that no system of rule of law works fairly or effectively, including importantly, I think it's also part of what Vietnamese citizens are talking about. And so you mentioned land disputes. There was a famous case recently in Hai Phong with the and the way that resonated with the Vietnamese people showed that they too recognize that there needs to be political reform that delivers rule of law, equality under the law, and fair judgments by courts in order for the progress that they want to continue. The Vietnamese government right now, for example, who are deeply concerned about corruption and who are publicly commenting on the need to tackle corruption. And so that would evidence that they
opportunity for Vietnam within the context of the TPP negotiations and the broader Asian Renaissance. But what leverage do we have to, again, help advance the government's understanding?
I think actually we do have considerable leverage, and the fact of our engaging and the way they look at the regional security issues, South China Sea issues, and the linkages they're forming with Japan, India, that's all mentioned. There is no doubt we acknowledge that the recent situation, if anything, has been backtracking. There's no question. And some of that is discouraging and disappointing, but I do hold promise that our engagement both with civil societies that are in Vietnam.
And advancing Vietnam's emergence and moving forward, and I think they have a role.
So I'm a Korean American, and their economic engagement is very helpful, as well as number of students now we're seeing from Vietnam as they go back. There's tens of thousands of them. I think all that people-to-people engagement can only help.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is next in line, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question, I think, population. And both Russia and Japan are actively working to deploy their nuclear technology in the country. A recent letter to the President from former defense and national security leaders explains that U.S. nuclear cooperation advances U.S. interests in nuclear safety, security, and nonproliferation, enables U.S. nuclear energy exports, and creates American jobs.
I think Vietnam, because of its energy needs, will have to rely quite a bit on for its additional needs on nuclear. We need to decide on a policy, what level of proliferation, especially on enrichment, an agreement with them. Once that agreement is concluded, I do believe it is in our interest, with safeguards in place, to...
With that, can you tell us, if you know, what the State Department is doing to expedite conclusion of a U.S.-Vietnam Section 123 agreement? I mean, have there been any specific measures taken? Is there a timeline? Is there a projected goal for a date of when that will be concluded? What can we expect in that regard?
I think before we engage in any more civilian nuclear 123 agreements, the administration has to decide what enrichment standard there will be in these agreements. So that has to come before. Vietnamese have told us that they are not interested in nuclear weapons. They are not interested in proliferation. And I think things they've said so far, there's no reason to doubt that. And they have, for example, they adhere to IAEA safeguards. They have signed the additional protocol. So I think it's really, I'm afraid to say, the burden is on the administration to get our global policy right first before we embark on particular country negotiations such as Vietnam.
Well, if you could take the message back, while the administration is trying to figure this out, the clock is ticking, and other relationships are being built and strengthened at the peril of our United States relationship with Vietnam, and particularly with our manufacturing sector, which could be a great benefit to both Vietnam and America. So while the administration is fiddling, Rome is burning, and we would urge them to move it up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's a point very well taken, sir.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to join you in expressing some dismay that the Office of the United States Special Trade Rep is not at the panel. By the way, Mr. Yun, I know that you said you took Mr. Perry's comments to heart. Hopefully you weren't taking to heart his metaphor, his analogy of Rome, burning while the administration fiddling, and I can't imagine you representing the administration believe that either.
I would say we're not fiddling.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to clear that right up.
The record will reflect that the administration claims it's not fiddling.
It is not fiddling. Nothing if not helpful to this administration, I think, Mr. Chair. I want to ask both of you, I mean, you're hearing it from all of us on both sides of this aisle, that the centrality of rule of law and respect for the spectrum of civil rights, human rights, we believe as Americans are universal. They're not culturally bound, and we understand that Vietnam is still evolving as a society, jurisprudence, but the stories of persecution based on religion, political dissent, media expression, the right to organize are legion. And because many of us have large Vietnamese American communities in our home districts, we hear about it a lot. Is the administration seized with the centrality of this set of issues in our bilateral relationship, or is this something that's sort of on the bucket list we have to address among many other items?
Thank you, sir. We are very much seized. I've had even 2 dialogues, and of course, and in which case we've always raised this issue as the central issue. I think my boss at that time, Secretary Clinton, raised it when she was in Hanoi last year. So this is an issue that comes up again and again, and us emphasizing, as you call it, centrality, that not more can be done in terms of strengthening the relationship until they meaningfully address the issue of human rights.
Dr. Baer?
Thank you. I agree with both the theory behind your things that I tried to emphasize when engaging with officials in Hanoi the month before last, was the fact that we raise these issues not because only true that our members of Congress hear from constituents and hear their concerns, but also because of our policy. Because, first of all, we're committed to universal human rights standards. Second of all, because we really believe that without progress on the rule of law, there will not be the possibility for the strong partnership that we desire to have with Vietnam and with other countries. There is a ceiling on their progress until they can make progress on human rights. Politics, it is a matter of policy, and because it affects their progress on a range of issues, concerns. No country in the region stands to benefit more from progress in partnership with the United States, And in order for that to happen, they have to make progress on human rights and rule of law.
It seems to me, too, my own observation, having been to Vietnam, it does have to go to China, but it doesn't have to go to Vietnam. And so you've got to establish some respect for the rule of law and an impact on the TPP. And if you want to see the TPP hit up against very rough waters and shoals, make sure this issue is not addressed. And I hope that message is taken back both to the government of Vietnam and our own government, because I'm somebody who's a free trader, but I am here to tell you, TPP will.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yun, you testified that human rights, quote, is not a single stovepipe issue. Rather, it's an issue that permeates the approach and engagement with Vietnam. While since bilateral trade agreement, certainly there has been a serious deterioration on all human rights issues in China, in Vietnam, and I would ask you, if you could perhaps speak to that. But last month, a high-level Obama administration delegation traveled to Vietnam to sell Westinghouse nuclear reactors to from the Energy Department, Dr. Pete Lyons, very, very high-level delegation. From what I gather, they were in Vietnam for 3 days. Was religious freedom raised? Was human trafficking raised? And if you could be precise.
I'll have to seek clarification and explanation from the
and tender names of people who have been incarcerated that ought to be freed. Secretary Young, one witness yesterday at our hearing, Dr. Nguyen Dinh Tung, president of Boat People SOS, testified that up to 500,000 U.S. citizens of Vietnamese origin have had their real estate and other properties stolen by the Vietnamese government. Property confiscation, as we know, even for Vietnamese themselves, is a very potent weapon being used against Christian and religious communities. The Catholics, of course, had their property stolen recently and several people beaten and a few killed. But not only does the Foreign Assistance Act prohibit foreign aid to any country that expropriates properties of U.S. citizens, again, we're talking about 500,000 people, but the State Department Legal Advisor's Office instructs American citizens whose property has been stolen. Yet, as Dr. Baer testified, while Vietnamese laws guarantee access to a lawyer and guarantees defense lawyers equal standing with the procurator, you also note, and I'm glad you note this, reality, though, plays out differently. It sure does. I met with one of the lawyers that you tried to meet with, Nguyen Van Dai in Hanoi. He was working on expropriation cases and other human rights cases. How do you find these lawyers? These human rights defenders are no standing in law because in 2003 there was a decree saying they're not going to give the properties back. So this has to be a government-to-government struggle. Why is the legal advisor dispensing such foolish, ill-informed negotiations? And I'm not talking about a tangential conversation about human rights. I'm talking about deeds, conditionality. We didn't get
on the expropriation issue. So again, I would say what Dan said, that we really do need for a comprehensive response. That will be substantially helpful. And then on other issues, for example, how does the government procurement deal with businesses? There is a government procurement chapter as well as investment chapter, and that's particularly relevant for Vietnam, where the public sector, especially state-owned enterprises, is so big, and you need some rules clarification. So overall, I do believe this will be key for reform, and in the also help aspects of human rights.
So political prisoners will not be a part of the TPP?
There is no direct chapter called human rights, sir.
Will we do that? Would you consider that? So I agree with my friend from Virginia. There will be huge opposition to this in the Congress, as there ought to be. Yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We have focused much on human rights, and I want to commend 3 bills to my colleagues. Most of my colleagues are familiar with these bills, but Zoe Lofgren's Free Vietnam Act, which links trade to human rights. Chris Smith, of course, has his Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013. Please put me on as a co-sponsor. And finally, the chairman of this committee with his resolution to once again list Vietnam as a country of particular concern with respect to religious freedom. I'm going to be a co-sponsor of all three of those now, and I would commend them to my colleagues. Now let's focus on the human rights of well over 10 million unemployed and underemployed Americans. Most economists would, if they had to pick a number, say that every $1 billion of trade deficit equates to a loss of 10,000 American jobs. And while the human rights advocates in Vietnam are suffering without justice, there's nothing justice about such unemployment in our country. Mr. Yoon, what is our trade surplus or deficit with Vietnam?
It's approximately $10 billion deficit.
Okay. My staff has me at 15 billion. In either case, it is substantial. Now, in our relations with many other countries, you can say, okay, there's a free market. We want to buy their stuff. They don't want to buy our stuff. So it's a fair game, and we got a trade deficit. But Vietnam is one of the most managed economies in the world. So the decision as to how much to import, especially the major goods, it's not like we're selling, individual pairs of shoes here. What America specializes in is huge infrastructure projects, maybe automobiles, maybe automobile factories. And so this trade deficit is a decision made in Hanoi. What have we done to tell the government in Hanoi that their access to the U.S. market is dependent upon them buying more of our exports?
So I'm not sure that you can directly relate the trade deficit to unemployment. By that account, if we did no trade, there would be no unemployment in the U.S.
Obviously, we would have a lower standard of living if we did no trade. But the fact is that if we were able to export as much as we import, we would have an unemployment rate of way less than 5% in this country with so much unemployment. In fact, we would have, as I say, if we were successful in selling as much as we buy, we would have virtually no. What have we done other than send them some glossy brochures about how wonderful Caterpillar earth-moving equipment is?
We raised the case of opening up markets, for example. So I would say TPP is an enormous tool.
TPP is a chance to dramatically expand the trade deficit, much to the loss of the unemployed in my district and districts around this country. What you're saying is Hanoi fully understands that they can make a governmental decision to buy less than $5 billion worth of our goods and still send $20 billion worth of their goods to the United States. And if our State Department was in tune with our constituents the way members of Congress have to be, we would have a different trade and foreign policy. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Lacking. That means that you do not have an independent judiciary in Vietnam. Is that correct?
That's correct.
An independent decision maker through the court system, right? So we end up having more of our people investing in Vietnam. They have no protection, correct?
I think individual cases may be resolved fairly on some basis, but they would have no tenable expectation
all based on the
reliable.
Based on the goodwill of the gangsters who are running. They don't have opposition political parties. So why would we think that there will ever be progress in a country like that? Or why would you think? The bottom line is, when you have a free press, your dirty deeds are exposed. When you have opposition parties, the opposition party will attack. That run Vietnam have made sure we don't have any of them in place. Isn't that correct? Okay. So what are we doing? We now are going to take that regime and we are going to sell them to the press because they have an iron grip on the throats of their own people. And they are, of course, putting a lot of money in their own pocket. Let me just state so everyone will know, and I hope the administration understands, providing nuclear capability to a group of gangsters like this, saying, well, of course, we can people who maintain that type of iron grip and a whole other society, we're going to give them a nuclear facility that could indeed, like as happened. I'm in the Science Committee, and we're capable now of building nuclear power plants that cannot be used the afterlies that do not disturb the proliferation issue, all right? Unless we are talking about those new type of reactors, you can expect that that deal with Vietnam will never go through, well, at least while this party is in power of the House. We'll see what the American voters say next time around. Let me also note that, do we call it Saigon or do we call it Ho Chi Minh City? What do we call it? Saigon is... so we've got a group of people that we can't even call that city by what the people down there really believe it is. The people in South Vietnam still in their hearts know it's Saigon and not Ho Chi Minh City, but we will make sure that we don't anger those people who are oppressing them. Finally, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So will that correct the problems that we just talked about? No rule of law, or no freedom of press, and no opposition parties. So will this, we're going to have this new partnership with them that we're going to include them, but they're still, does that mean they're going to have a rule of law after that? And they're going to have opposition parties and freedom of the press?
So I don't think anyone's pretending that TPP is a cure-all, but I do believe that it is a progress, one step forward.
Yeah, let me note that for decades we were told that all we have to have are these economic agreements with China, and China was going to liberalize politically. I called it the hug-a-Nazi, make-a-liberal theory. The fact is, it's been decades, and there has been no liberalization politically in China whatsoever, and they are still repressing their people. So thus, we are now going to that formula and seeing that it will work in Vietnam as well. Well, you know the definition of insanity, doing the same thing and expecting different outcomes. This is insane. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thinking what we're going through here, but I want to go back to a different line of question here for just a moment, and it does refer to the TPP a little bit. Currently, there is odds with the U.S. and Vietnam is expecting its U.S. market share to increase from 7 to 30% if allowed to export state-subsidized textile goods. Secretary Yoon, where do you stand on this issue?
If you like, we will get back a written response.
Well, I'd also like to know what the assurances the American textile industry can have in this situation, in which, you know.
Mr. Collins, if I could, and just two quick questions, and you didn't get back on whether or not you support the Vietnam Human Rights Act. Would appreciate it if you would. But on two very specific questions, the State Department recently announced a $450,000 in funding to local Vietnamese NGOs to promote democracy in Vietnam. Genuine advocates for. Secondly, the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance is designed by and was launched by Hillary Clinton to engage diaspora communities in the U.S. to contribute. Contributions are for trade, investment, volunteerism, philanthropic initiatives, and innovation, and no human rights. Can you tell us why? Why was human rights excluded?
Joe has generously said that I should take all of the questions. You and I have had many discussions on human rights in a range of places, and I share your commitment. I don't want to comment now on legislation that is pending before Congress, but I can certainly say that I personally am very sympathetic to the intentions and the concerns that underlie that, as well as other. On the $450,000, you know, my bureau makes a concerted effort around the world to engage without regard for whether or not On my last trip to Vietnam, I will say that when I was there for the Human Rights Dialogue, I was there for 4 days, and I've honestly felt more encouraged than I have on a process on the Constitution, who are seeing it as an opportunity to point out areas of inconsistency with universal human rights standards. And we will continue to look to do what we have no intention, desire, reason to support Agongo. Agongos get plenty of support from the government, and they don't need ours. What we want to support are
I still have their business cards.
Individual citizens. I've run into that too. You know, part of the problem is a recent decree also made it illegal to have independent organizations that comment on policy issues, which caused one of the only real independent think tanks in the country to have to shut down. But they're figuring out how to keep going with conversations among a group of intellectuals who are making arguments about what's best in terms of reform for the country.
And on the IDEA, the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance?
I don't work on that, and so unless Joe knows something about
Could you get back to us on that?
We will get back to you in writing.
And try to add that as a category? I mean, it seems to be a no-brainer to me.
Yep. I will get back to you.
And almost out of time, again, Secretary Young, if you could get back to us about the, in detail, who they spoke to when they were in Vietnam. I'm talking about the high-level delegation that was, that is read by our interlocutors as false, as insincere, superficial. If you're going to have an engagement, it has to be real and robust. Thank you.
Will do so.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You all have both detailed the continued problems that you hear while you're in Vietnam about the failure to implement the laws, the failure to protect citizens' constitutional rights, free speech and religion, and the denial of guaranteed right to counsel by prisoners. And you've mentioned a number of things, but I'd kind of like to get a top 10 hit list of failures to implement the rule of law in Vietnam that are particularly poignant to you. Maybe you could go back and forth, do 1, 2, 3, 4.
I think Mr. Smith once asked me to name this in front of members of Congress. So rather than a top 10 list, I will tell you that obviously we remain deeply concerned about a number of issues with respect to religious groups in terms of getting space to build places of worship, et cetera. So there's a range of rule of law issues that affect religious freedom in Vietnam. Freedom of expression, which increasingly includes the internet issues that we're seeing. And here we're seeing happening in Vietnam what is happening around the world, which is that governments are not content management that would further restrict the online space in Vietnam. So freedom of expression. Freedom of association is a place where and point out failings and hold governments to account. And it is what we have seen work, and we have never seen rule of law work in a sustained way without that. And they are good as examples to illustrate the broad range of our concerns.
Does the State Department have any facility or program that monitors these?
On human rights conditions, which cover all countries around the world. Our report on Vietnam is, it's maybe 100 pages, maybe longer, but in that range. It goes through, on an annual basis, a range of concerns that we have specific reporting on human rights worldwide.
Right. I guess, I don't want to get you in crossways by coming up with a top 10 list of, maybe that would be an easier one.
I've got a minute and 19 seconds to come up with 10 items. I would say, let me see how many I get to. But one is certainly in our diplomatic engagements, as Joe and I have talked about, not only through mechanisms like the Human Rights Dialogue, but the limits on that relationship without progress on those issues. Also, I would say that we are engaging with partners around the world. This week, shine a spotlight on our concerns, so to apply pressure that way. We work to support civil society and those within Vietnam who are making the case for change. We think that that is an important piece of the long-term progress and solution. We work to engage the business community to make sure that they too understand what they have to gain by seeing progress in rule of law, which you don't have to, it doesn't take long to explain it. They get Vietnamese economy as well. As I've said before, Vietnam cannot become what Vietnam wants to become if the next Bill Gates is sitting in a prison.
Thank you very much. We'll go to a second round. I just have a couple of questions. I probably won't take up the full 5 minutes, so if other members that are still here would like to ask a few questions, we'll do that, but I don't think these will take too long. My first question is this. Vietnam reportedly is seeking open rights as Sudan and Cuba, Iran, and other notables. That being said, what is the administration's position on obtaining a seat if it really means anything anymore to be on that committee?
Thank you, Congressman. As you probably know, 6 candidates, including Vietnam, also China and Saudi Arabia, as well as Nepal and a couple others. I'll tell you that the way that we choose who we're going to support is we choose governments whose record on human rights reflects what we think is a high standard of human rights in the world.
What do they respond when you tell them that their competitors are countries like China and
of human rights in the world? Part of what we do to try to ensure that is that we do not trade votes for the Human Rights Council, and unfortunately many of our European friends do trade votes, and that means that they end up voting for states who should not be supported based on their own human rights records.
Okay, maybe it's just repeating the obvious, but with the human rights abuses that we've heard discussed here today, seems like they'd fit right in on the, have criticized the State Department's country reports and the report on international religious freedom for lack of specificity, depth, and at times access or in prison. Members of the different persecuted churches who have made it to America have reported that the Vietnamese government sets up alternative religious organizations so as to eliminate the genuine ones. There is major concern that the State Department has only been allowed free access to these fake religious groups and not to the genuine ones. Now, there are some victims who've made it to freedom, and some of them have recently testified, one being the Venerable Don Toll of the Khmer Krom Buddhist Church, and of course he's been repeatedly tortured and other horrific types of things that they managed to escape the country, and exiled leaders of the persecuted churches, I think, would be a valuable source of information for the Department of State's report and CPC designation. Would the State Department consider convening meetings with, for example, the Cao Dai Church and the Ho Hao Buddhist Church and the
I convene on a regular basis with representatives of the Vietnamese American community, as well as people who happen to be in the people who I don't get access to. But in pulling together those reports, it should be clear that we don't just rely on the people who we're able to talk to. We do seek out information from others. We try to, or not only our diplomats, but those around the world who use our reports to work from as they advocate for change. We did report this year on the defrocking of a Khmer Krom Buddhist. We do report on specific incidents when we get those reports. And if you're getting any constituents who are coming to you with either inaccuracies or things that they think should be included in the reports, I would welcome them submitting their information or reaching out to my office at the State Department.
All right. Thank you very much. I said I would try not to use my full 5 minutes, but did. So apologize for that, and I'll now yield to the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Feliama Vega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had about 100 additional questions I wanted to ask on the West Papuans in Indonesia, the status of the treatment of the West Papuan people there by the government of Indonesia. And I do want to members of this committee and the tremendous work and dedication that this gentleman has given on the issue of human rights throughout the world. And
using it right now.
Yeah, and again, gentlemen, thank you for coming. I'm going to forego my questions for now. I yield back.
Okay. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your courtesy and for extending time for me and members who are. Saudi Arabia is a CPC country because of their terrible crackdown on religious freedom and their persecution of people of faith. But I do have, so if you could speak, and others, who said that there are approximately 3,000 Vietnamese-owned sweatshops in and around Moscow alone, each employing from a prostitution is what they are served and given. Sadly, they are coerced into it. About 30% of the Vietnamese laborers in Russia, in April hearing about human trafficking, Mrs. Hui Dong, that trafficking victims seeking help from the Vietnamese embassy in Moscow are refused or actually returned to their traffickers to finish their, quote, contracts. Vietnam has still not paid citizens who worked in the Daewoo factory, and that's now over 10 years old. The most recent trafficking in persons report had your departments feed into it. Ambassador Lucy DeBacca certainly has a key role in all of that. But we know there's unbelievable pressure put on by others in the State Department to keep it not on worse when it comes to human trafficking. The woman who testified and sat where you sit now talked about her family member, her sister, and others that she knew who had been trafficked. I mean, the woman was in tears, as you would expect she would be, over this terrible government complicity in these heinous crimes in modern-day slavery. So if you could, Tier 3, and also speak to CPC.
Thank you, Congressman. With respect to CPC time, working with the Vietnamese to outline the steps that they would need to take to be removed from that list, and Secretary Rice removed them from that list in 2006. We are constantly looking at it. We have seen a couple positive steps, like the uptick in registrations that's happened in the first part of this year.
The northern part of Vietnam, churches, house churches that would love to be registered, and they're not, and they are so discriminated against.
And I made the case to my interlocutor in April. I said, you know, watching they know that they are aware of CPC. They don't want to be designated as CPC. We have made it clear that we are watching closely, that we are reviewing at all times, and that we will be watching things like the registrations and like the implementing regulations that come out around the decree that took effect in January of this year that should expand, not contract, religious freedom in Vietnam. We also talked about the Evangelical Church of Vietnam. The northern and southern branches would like to merge, and they've had bureaucratic obstruction in their attempts to do so. Made clear that that's a step that the government should facilitate in order to demonstrate good faith and a willingness to make progress on religious freedom concerns.
What about on trafficking?
On trafficking, I do not. I'm not part of the bureaucratic process that you referred to in terms of making the designations. Certainly, I raised trafficking issues, and they were part of the human rights dialogue. In terms of your specific questions and the examples you gave about the conditions in Russia, I'd like to go back to my.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think on trafficking, we do have a process, and I've been involved in that process. In Vietnam case, you're right. I mean, they need to make improvement. Having said that, also, they have made some correct steps, including having a trafficking, is how much they have done in that particular year. And that's a very important point. And I think, all things considered, they are, as you know, Tier 2 watch list. I do think that's an appropriate tier ranking for them.
If I could, with your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, very briefly.
Gentleman's recognized.
The problem with mere passage of a law without effective implementation is exactly what Dr. Baer mentioned earlier about the guarantee of a lawyer, a defense attorney for those who have been accused, and it doesn't happen in real life. And the problem, they are gaming the system. This is one of the worst trafficking countries in the world, and yet they'll pass a law or a resolution. It becomes not meaningless, but almost meaningless, but it becomes a great talking point to raise in a human rights dialogue or in some other forum. So I would ask you to look really hard-nosed at the record, because the record is horrible. Look at the testimony, if you would, of the woman who testified at our committee, because that is a microcosm of a very, and almost like the tip of an iceberg of what is truly going on by this government.
The gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to thank the members who had attended this afternoon. I'd like to thank our panel of experts this afternoon. And I'd also like to thank the folks who attended to come before the committee. We're adjourned. Thank you.